Hello, Catherine Foley is my name, and it's 5 o'clock, so I'm going to read a chapter from my book Beyond the Breakwater. So it's chapter 21 today, and it's called Joe. We usually met on important family occasions in our aunt's sitting room in Helvig, which was about 2 miles further along the road from us, at the furthest point on the peninsula. As a treat, us girls would always have Barley's lime cordial, while my mother would have some cherry brandy, and my father and uncle had Guinness and some whisky. My aunts only drank tea. We loved our visits to Helvig because we could listen to the adults talking about old times, and of course we took part in the sing-song when it started. My Uncle Joe was usually called on to sing first, because he loved to and because his voice was rich and melodious. He relished singing, and he had a store of songs that he'd learned from listening to artists like Johnny Cash and Jim Reeves. Roger Whittaker's The Last Farewell was one of his favourites. After a swallow of Guinness to soothe his throat, he'd put his glass down carefully on the coffee table and compose himself. His face would take on a dreamy, serious expression. Then he'd lift his head and begin, his deep, rich voice filling the room with the music and the story. There's a ship lies rigged and ready in the harbour. Tomorrow for old England she sails. We loved this song because it told a story. I especially enjoyed the chorus with its lilting, easy melody. For you are beautiful, and I have loved you dearly, more dearly than the spoken word can tell. We were hooked from the start of The Last Farewell. A ring of stout around his mouth was a sign that Joe was truly in the moment, and it seemed to add to the piquancy of the words because there was a sadness about Joe that none of us young people could ever miss, and that none of us ever came close to understanding. We all joined in at the chorus, singing along with Joe from Passage. The fact that Joe was a merchant seaman and fisherman who had gone to sea as a young man, working on ocean liners and oil rigs and trawlers, seemed to give the song an added pathos. He had never married, and I always felt that when he sang those songs of lost love, it was heartfelt in some way. There was a vulnerability and an incongruity about Joe that made me feel slightly embarrassed sometimes. The angelic quality of his voice and his open, trusting eyes seemed to ask a question that sometimes left me feeling sad. As he sang, he'd lift his head up at certain points, almost in sympathy with the fate of the tragic sailor, to check to see if we understood. Time slowed down as his voice filled the room. Joe had thick black eyebrows over dark brown eyes that seemed to hold your gaze when he looked at you in moments of honest appraisal. He had a head of rich dark brown hair, a strong jawline and a fine profile. He was handsome in a masculine way. He smoked major cigarettes, and the tops of the fingers on his left hand were brown from years of holding the stubs in his hand. He walked with a limp, and one shoe was always built up by the cobbler to compensate for the shorter leg that had shriveled when he was in his late teens. It was many years before we learned that this wastage of the bone could sometimes happen, in particular to young men following intense physical activity. And we knew Joe had cycled a lot and played a great deal of hurling as a young man, so we presumed that this was how it had happened. Because of this wastage, Joe sat in the armchair in his own characteristic way, with one leg outstretched and the shorter leg folded under him. Those times remain clear in my memory now, of Joe singing with emotion, of other worlds and times. Looking out the window in Helvig, I remember the grey-green sea stretching off down the coastline to the east towards Hook Head in the distance and the town of Dungarvan visible in the west. I can see the seagulls following in the wake of maybe an occasional trawler or boat. Joe seemed to favour songs about loneliness, about drinking, and about disappointment. He loved songs by the American singer Dean Martin. I asked the man, he'd sing behind the bar, for the jukebox, and the music takes me back to Tennessee. He used to lift his shoulders in a semi-shrug as he sang the last line. When they ask who's the fool in the corner crying, I say, little old wine drinker me. Now the words and the music of the songs he sang merge into a collage of melodies, and the notes unfolding slowly in my head remind me of Joe's voice rising effortlessly. Unhurried, he'd pause like any singer if a long breath was required. He'd often close his eyes, but sometimes he'd look into the near distance as he put his heart into the words. Years later, he lay in hospital, smiling like a baby, his eyes clear like an infant staring out from a pram. His memory was gone, and his words were all fragmented or lost. But the nurses were always kind to him, and often asked to see photographs of him as a young man, because they could see how handsome he must have been, and they responded to an innocence in his eyes. He died in his late 60s in hospital. We buried him on an icy cold day in January in the graveyard in Crook. There were hailstones, and yet the freezing air that day on the exposed coastal graveyard seemed right somehow. Like the words of the song of The Last Farewell, which Roger Whittaker sang in the 1970s, I felt he had gone away to a land full of endless sunshine, and he had left the rainy skies and gales behind. On that last day in the cemetery, when I said goodbye to Uncle Joe, I remembered him singing The Last Farewell in Helvig, and all of a sudden the words came back to me as if he was there beside me, smiling. So that's it for today. Go rath maith agaibh. Talk to you again tomorrow at 5. Bye.